Hi, my name is Dawn Hendricks, and I'm the Director of Training for the VCU Autism Center for Excellence. I'm presenting today on determining an effective communication system for students with autism spectrum disorder. At VCU AAC, we created what we call a state goal. The reason why we call this a state goal is because we realize that there are certain concerns and issues that impact every child with autism spectrum disorder across the state. And certainly, enhancing communication is one of those issues. So before you on this slide, you will see our state goal, and I'm certainly not going to read the whole thing to you, but I'm going to point out some of the key elements. So we have VCU AAC will develop guidelines and resources. These guidelines and resources you actually can find on our website. We have been well underway developing these so that we provide access to different resources that will assist educational teams in enhancing communication of students with autism. We want to improve the communication capabilities of all students, and that's really key, looking at all students with ASD, so that each is able to effectively communicate across environments and for a variety of purposes. We know there's different reasons why we communicate, there's different functions, and so this was an important part of this goal as well. And finally, if you drop on down to the bottom, you will see that we have addressed a variety of different areas. So number one, identification of communication goals for students with ASD. Implementation of communication learning opportunities. In other words, the student can't learn if there's not opportunities to learn in different learning trials. It's like any other goal. It's like teaching reading or math. They cannot learn it if they do not have the opportunity. Implementation of strategies and support. So these are the evidence-based practices that we need to teach communication. Development and application of a systematic plan for enhancing communication capabilities. We can't do it if we don't have a plan. And then finally, commitment to developing an individualized, long-term mode of communication. And this is what we'll be talking about today. As part of the state goal, we have been developing tools to help educational teams to do just this, to identify a mode of communication that's effective for the student with autism and a mode that becomes long-term and that person can use across his or her lifetime. As part of this work, we had a committee of experts in autism and in communication. So here on the slide, you'll see the names of individuals who were a part of this initiative, and we want to thank each one. Each one gave tirelessly, volunteered a lot of hours, and spent a lot of time helping us to develop tools as well as pilot those tools. So before we get started on the tools that we have developed to really enhance communication and really focus on augmentative and alternative communication systems, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So I want to ask the question to each of you, and I want you each to think about these as I talk about them. Can we agree? Learning to communicate and enhancing skills is considered to be a profound and indisputable individual right. This is part of our human rights, to be able to communicate effectively. And really, when we change our mindset to think about this as a human right, just like literacy is something that we consider in education to be one of our rights, just like a public education is one of our rights. Learning to communicate and being independent with it and more effective with it is, again, an indisputable right. If we consider this, if we change our mindset, then this becomes a focus of our education that we provide for our students with autism. As this becomes a focus, we see that this is reasonable, we see that it's achievable. And we see that we can really impact outcomes for all of our students with autism. Next, can we agree? The use of augmentative and alternative communication is a way to enhance communication for all students, and it is not dependent on communicative ability. We can see that when considering the mode, there is a continuum of communication abilities with our students with autism. And so if we think about verbal communication and we think about augmentative and alternative communication systems such as sign language, picture exchange, verbal output systems, all those different systems, there's a continuum here. So let's go through those items. Number one, we can have an individual who's very adept with their system. Perhaps we have someone who's very verbal and can meet all of their needs and have reached their optimum potential with that system, whether it's sign language, verbal, picture exchange, whatever it might be. Next, we can have an individual who has a system but is currently unable to use that system to meet his or her full potential. So in other words, maybe that person is able to verbally request 1 or 2 items, or maybe that person is able to ask for help using sign language. However, that person is unable to meet other needs and use communication for other functions. And so we're seeing that there's a limitation here for that particular student. And then finally, we have an individual who has no communication system and little or no unaided communication capability. Now, very often with AAC, we think about the person who fits the description at the bottom of this slide. One of the things we have to think about is AAC can and may be appropriate for anyone here on this continuum. So we really have to think about the abilities of the students and whether this will help enhance the communication abilities. Again, it's an individual right, and this is something very important for our outcomes of our students. And finally, can we agree? The use of AAC does not stifle verbal communication, but in many cases can actually assist in its development. Very often we find that individuals, that teams, that teachers, that parents may be hesitant to use an AAC system, whether it's sign language, picture exchange, verbal output, whatever it might be, because they feel like they want the student to learn verbal communication versus using this AAC system. However, we have a lot of research, a lot of information that says this simply is not true, but in many cases it can actually assist in its development. In other words, for some students, for some individuals, beginning to use an AAC system will actually facilitate or foster that verbal communication. I personally have a philosophy that we should try to teach verbal communication to our students with autism. We have great strategies now where we can be successful in many, many instances, but certainly AAC does not stifle that growth, but instead can sometimes accelerate it or add other options so that they have multiple modalities. So let's now turn our attention to the tools that the VCU Autism Center for Excellence have developed in order to help educational teams to address this issue. How do we create a long-term system of communication for the student with autism? We are going to be talking about the following documents. First of all, we have an augmentative and alternative communication consideration flow chart. We next have an AAC inventory and what is also called the AAC Inventory Guidance Document. So for the inventory, which is basically a screening, I don't want to call it an assessment tool, but an informal assessment tool, there's a guidance document that provides directions on how to use it. And then finally we have the AAC System Feature Analysis and also the supplemental guidance document. Now before I continue on, these documents are available on the website. So if you've not had a chance to download those, they will be helpful as you view this webcast to actually have those tools with you so that you can look at them, read through them as I explain each document and piece of the documents. So the next question I want to answer is, why develop these tools? The reason why we decided to spend so much time and energy as it related to this goal, because communication is big, there's so many different components to it, is because we wanted to empower teams. We wanted educational teams to say, I have the knowledge and I have the skills to make decisions to really be able to identify a system or systems that's appropriate for a student. We find very often in school divisions across the state that sometimes teams do not feel empowered. They feel very hindered by not having all the information or feeling like they do not have enough information to make a decision. And very often we get this paralysis that occurs that because maybe they don't feel like they have enough information or they don't know every single tool that's available, that therefore they're not able to make a decision is not made. Then that student continues to go on without a communication modality whatsoever. And that is not the right answer. The whole wait and see or let's have someone else do it is not the right answer when it comes to communication for our students. So we want to empower teams to say you do have the information, you do have the ability to make these decisions, Certainly with AAC, one of the things I want to stress is there's not a perfect system for every student. I think that's part of the paralysis, is that very often we think there's going to be the perfect system. And what we want to show you through our tools is that there is a good match. There is a way that you can make a strong match and that you can really move that student forward with the appropriate tool. So if you work with a student, or if you have a son or a daughter, and AAC is warranted. Remember, we go back to that continuum where we have some students who might not have a modality whatsoever to communicate, and you have some who need it enhanced to be more effective. Then what we can do is we can look at two different approaches. One is having a practical approach, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The practical approach is an informal approach. Again, it's using the tools developed by VCU AAC to say, I can take enough information about this person, this student, his or her characteristics, his or her needs and priorities. I can match it to the systems out there, and we can make a decision and move forward. This can be an educational team decision. And then finally, in some occasions, you will find that you may need a more formal approach. Many of you in your school divisions will have a formal approach set up. In other words, you might have an AT team, an assistive technology team, or perhaps you have an AAC team, or maybe there's an area health facility that provides some sort of formal evaluation. But as you find that you have a student in need of AAC, then there's a formal procedure, you make a referral, a team comes in, does a formal evaluation, and then a recommendation is made. And certainly in some instances, we don't want to say that this is not needed, because in some instances it is. And in some instances, you might go through the practical approach and still not be able to come to a good consensus and then move to the formal. But again, this is about empowering you. This is about saying you do have tools and you do have the ability to make these decisions so that that student can communicate tomorrow, not 6 months from tomorrow. So who is the team? When we talk about this, let's go back here, when we talk about this practical approach, who is the team? Well, first of all, we want to include the student, of course. This is going to be important. The parent, special ed teacher, if you're an early interventionist, the early interventionist. We want the speech pathologist. And then I have under the category of other team members who may be a part of this as well. Certainly those 4 are critical to the decision making of the communication modality. Others include the administrator. And often an administrator can help to identify the resources that are available and help with that component of determining the communication system. Perhaps an occupational or physical therapist. This might be especially important for a student who has any sort of motor delays of any kind, whether that's fine motor or gross motor. It might be an important consideration, as we'll see a little bit later on with our selection. And then finally, if that student is accessing general ed, the general ed teacher. And you want to think about other environments. Where will the student be? Where will he or she be using this system? Which the answer should be every environment he or she is participating. So you'll want to think about those professionals and those individuals and those family members who also might be able to provide some information. So let's look at our first tool. The first tool we're going to look at is really a very simple tool. It's a way to get you started. And I want to stress, it's a way to get you started. This tool that we're going to look at, the AAC Consideration Flow Chart, is not the end-all be-all. But it is a way to get you started. It is a way to break things down into some pretty simple decisions to say this might be a route for us to explore. So let's look at this tool. It really breaks our decision making down into looking at, do we want to consider a low-tech system? A low-tech system can include exchange systems, so whether that's object exchange, picture exchange, icon exchange. A low-tech system also includes a single page, such as a GoTalk, so one single page showing icons or pictures, or a touchscreen device, such as a smartphone or a tablet or something of that nature. A high-tech speech-generating device is the other option, so we're going to consider low-tech, high-tech, which includes speech-generating devices, voice output systems. So here it is, and again, if you have these documents, if you had the chance to download them, I would encourage you to take a look at the one you have in front of you. So again, this is the AAC Communication Consideration Flow Chart. And you will see at the very top we have asked 2 questions, and these 2 questions will guide you through the hierarchy down the right path. So the first question, the student is not able to use picture symbols to request desired items, objects, or actions. So you're going to answer that question. Or the student is able to independently use picture symbols to do these things, to make the request of desired items, objects, and actions. If the student is not, then you're going to answer the question, is he or she able to discriminate pictures? So very often we will try to use a picture-based system for children who are not able to discriminate pictures. And so if that student is not yet able to discriminate pictures, then we'll want to think about doing some other things. Number 1, picture discrimination is one of those life skills that we will want to focus on and begin targeting for that student. But we'll also want to consider the use of sign language and consider the use of an object exchange system. On the other side of this equation, if he or she is able to discriminate pictures, then we're going to consider one of those low-tech systems. So again, remember this is a picture or icon exchange, or a tablet, or some sort of single-page device. And I will scroll down to the bottom of this document in just 1 second so we can consider looking at the rest of our flow chart. Now if we flip over to the other side again, that student is able to independently use picture symbols to request. If he or she is not, it's going to take us to the other side of the flow chart and take us back into those low-tech system options. So here are our considerations on either side of the page, on either side of the flow chart. So let's again start on the left-hand side. This is a person who is currently unable to use pictures to make requests. So let's look at some of the questions we're going to ask. Some questions related to the student. Does the student have difficulty holding or picking up pictures? Does the student lack mobility and unable to approach other people? Will the use of technology provide motivation to the student? Look at those 3 questions. If the answer is no to all of those, then we're going to consider a picture exchange system. If it's yes to any of those, then we might want to consider a single-page device like a GoTalk or something of that nature, or a touchscreen tablet or smartphone or some sort of device of that nature. Other things that we want you to think about. Now this is where it gets a little tricky because I think it's a little easier for us to think about the student characteristics, but we also have to think about some of the maintenance factors. One of the things that I think becomes a barrier to AAC and its selection and implementation and continued use is the maintenance of it. And so we'll want to consider some questions here such as, is the student's team unable to print pictures and maintain materials needed for picture-based systems? That's a reality in some places, that printing of pictures is not possible, or printing of colored pictures may not be possible. And if that's the case, you will want to think long and hard as far as what kind of system you select, because what you do not want to do is limit that child's communication because you simply cannot print the pictures or give him or her access to new icons, new photographs, and things as that student is learning. The other maintenance factor is the student's team able to program and maintain a technology-based system. Again, I have seen this issue hinder teams very frequently, that we have a technology-based system and the team does not know how to keep it up, or perhaps there's only one technological expert on the team who's able to maintain it in some sort of way. So these are just a couple of maintenance factors that you'll want to think about as you determine, might a picture exchange system be more appropriate, or might something like a single page or touchscreen tablet be more appropriate. Again, I mentioned this is a pretty simple document here, so some really basic considerations to help steer you in one direction. Now let's go to the other side, and this is for a student who is able to use pictures independently to communicate. If we look at our very first consideration at the top, is the student able to use the low-tech system to request at least 30 items, objects, or actions? And I will tell you, as a subcommittee, we looked at that number 30 long and hard. So that is not an arbitrary number, but instead it does have some meaning to our group, and we want you to apply that meaning as you're making decisions for your students. If you have a student who's using, for example, an icon or a picture-based exchange system, Once you get to 30 items, I'm sure you can agree that that system becomes pretty unwieldy. You have multiple pages, you've Velcroed them in the books, the pictures are getting lost, they're falling out of the book. So that's one of the pieces, is just it becomes cumbersome, it becomes hard for that student to carry and move from place to place. Again, if he's going from music class to PE to the general ed classroom, wherever it might be, that becomes a very big cumbersome system, so that's another reason. But we also have the issue of growth. If that student is now requesting at least 30 items, then he or she is probably moving along pretty quickly and learning new nouns and verbs and maybe even sentences and those kinds of things pretty quickly. And so it's time for us to move on. It's time for us to grow and to allow that student to grow. The next consideration, actually the next two considerations. Have the student's communication skills grown in complexity? And then will a high-tech speech generating device promote use of a variety of communicative functions? In other words, is that student's communication abilities growing? And you can look at that, and you can look at IEP goals and objectives, and you can look at his or her abilities and make those determinations pretty readily to say, okay, this will help us to know it's time to move into something more complex, such as a speech generating device. One of the things that we have as a committee agreed on is we need students to communicate today. And that's really important. And I know sometimes it's tempting to think about a system that might be appropriate for that student 2 or 3 years down the road. And I don't want to dissuade you from doing that, but I do want to strongly encourage you to think about what will help that student to communicate today. And so these types of questions can help you do that. Has that student's communication abilities grown so that we know that if we use a complex speech generating device that has multiple pages and a lot of icons and abilities to put them together into phrases and sentences and questions, that student is ready to move into something like that and be able to use it with our teaching and instruction, of course. And then finally, just as we had student factors on the other side and maintenance factors, we also have that here. And this is really more important for us to think about those technology issues. Is the student's team able to program and maintain a complex system? Again, making sure that you have individuals who perhaps are not ready to do that today, but they can be trained and they can have the ability to keep that system up should something happen to it. And so we can see the determinations there based on how you answer these questions to say we should consider staying with a low-tech system, or at this point we should move on to a high-tech speech generating device. And then finally, I want to draw your attention to the bottom with item number 3. The student has a visual or hearing impairment, which will impact the system selected. And if that's the case, we have another document I'm going to talk about later, which is called the Feature Match Analysis, and you should address that document to help with students who might have those complex needs. The next two documents I'm going to draw your attention to, the Augmentative and Alternative Communication Inventory, and then as I mentioned earlier, the AAC Inventory Guidance document. In other words, the directions. How do you use the inventory? So if you have those in front of you, pull those out and we'll take a look at those. With the AAC Inventory, we have broken this process, this tool down into 3 steps. Step 1. The information gathering phase. Step 2, the decision-making phase. And step 3, the trial implementation phase. And I'm going to talk about all 3 of these. This is a quick look at the actual guidance document. I'm not going to pull that out today and go through it in detail. Again, it is there for your use. So as you're using the inventory itself, you will have the guidance document that can provide the directions in detail. This front page that you see is kind of a real quick checklist to help you be organized and to help you be ready when you actually use this inventory. And so, for example, on this page, you will see step 1, which is the information gathering phase. Part 1 is we're going to discuss the present communication modalities. We're going to talk about communication history. So there's a quick little note here that says, it would be a good idea to review the students' records before we get into this meeting and use this inventory so that we can answer these questions appropriately and accurately. Part 3 is the student considerations and AAC feature analysis. For this, there's a document called the Feature Analysis. You'll need to make sure you have copies of that for all team members participating in this particular inventory. And then you'll also want chart paper to list the results. And so again, this is the checklist to make sure you have the tools you need, the materials you need, and that you're ready to use this inventory with the team. So now on to the inventory itself. And again, I'm going to go back to that slide I had earlier about the team. This is something to be completed by the team. So again, we think about students, parents, special ed teachers, speech language pathologists, and then of course we can include those other participants as is appropriate for the student. So the top of this page, we can see that it's blue. We have color-coded these documents for ease of use. And so we can see that it's blue and just some basic information about the student. So let's go on down to part 1, which is the present communication modalities. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to answer some basic questions about how the student presently communicates. And the word effectively is there. And you see a variety of different ways, ranging from gestures to sign language to typing to voice output devices, so you'll want to make sure you think about that. It's nice to have the array of team members because perhaps there's things used in the home that's not used at school, and vice versa. So you can think about effective communication and the different modalities currently used. And then if you drop on down, we're going to talk about those that are emerging. Again, our focus here is how do we help that student communicate effectively today? And if we can really hone in on how is he communicating or she communicating now and what are those emerging ways, those are the places we want to start. This will really help us to identify the most appropriate system or systems for the students by focusing on these particular areas. So spend a few minutes among the team discussing both current communication as well as those emerging skills. Next, we have the communication history. As noted a few minutes ago, you'll want to make sure if a record review is needed, that you have the records available or that you've done that before this meeting. Again, this is where multiple team members are helpful because very often the parents, having been there through the child's entire educational career, can provide a lot of information about different systems or modalities that were attempted and the results of those. And so you're going to document that here. And one of the columns that you see on the far right is the system recommended for consideration? And so you'll want to think about this. So you'll want to fill this table in and document the system and the description that was attempted at some point with the student, the date attempted, the results obviously. Think about this question though, because very often what we find is that sometimes we attempt using a system with a child when either the student wasn't quite ready. So for example, perhaps we try to use a picture-based exchange system using icons when the student doesn't yet have picture discrimination, and so we didn't meet a lot of success in the beginning. Or perhaps we have a situation where it wasn't implemented to the fidelity and integrity that it needed to be. And so some of these things can be accounted for because very often what we can do is find that perhaps something that we tried a little earlier may be successful a little bit later on down the road. So this table is not to say what has been tried and things that are out of question, but this table is to say what has been tried, what were the results, and do we want to consider those again? Do we want to put those in the mix? Was there some promise there? Was there may be a potential now because of some skills that the student has developed and those sorts of things? All right, next we go on to part 3, the student considerations and the AAC system feature analysis. Now this is going to take you to a whole separate document. And it's going to take you to a pretty, what seems like a complex document, but we have tried to really make this as simple as possible. Let me explain for a second what the feature analysis is. What we have done is we have looked at student characteristics and we have really worked to prioritize those based on what are the characteristics that are most important to think about and to consider when choosing an AAC system. So we've gone from those that impact the most students or are the most important to those that are that may impact fewer students. And so what you will see on this page, this is still part of the inventory, is that you will see a list. You see symbol considerations, the student's learning abilities and needs, issues related to typing, usability, gross motor difficulties, fine motor difficulties, hearing difficulties, and vision difficulties. Again, if we think about this in a hierarchy, symbol consideration, learning abilities and needs will impact every student as far as our considerations. If we scroll on down, typing, not going to impact every student, it's going to impact fewer students. If we keep going down, and let's drop all the way down to the bottom to hearing difficulties and vision difficulties, it's going to impact fewer students. And so we put this in a hierarchy, so if you are doing the inventory, you can say for every student we need to consider the symbol and the learning abilities and needs, and then we can determine whether we consider these other areas based on the specific characteristics of that student. So let's take a look at our document. So this is what it looks like, very colorful. The color has meaning. We have color coded this as well. I am going to jump out of here and go pull up the document, so bear with me just one second. Okay, so here we are, looking at the document itself, and we can look up at the top, see the directions. Across the top heading, we see the different types of system options. I'll go ahead and read those. First of all, we have object exchange, icon exchange, for example, picture or symbols. Single page device, we talked about that earlier. A touchscreen device using communication apps. So again, a tablet or a smartphone, something like that. A multiple page device with voice output and access to unlimited icons for novel messages. So multiple pages means that I have an electronic system that will allow me toggle between different pages. So perhaps I have a page that represents basic words like I and want and maybe some different verbs and stuff like that. And then I have a page that represents food, and then I have a page that represents toys, and then I have a page that represents video games, or whatever that student needs to communicate. We can have different pages to represent that, and so they can move between those pages and have lots of options to communicate and to build sentences and to ask questions and to do those sorts of things. And then finally, we have a multiple page device with voice output access to unlimited icons and semantically compact intuitive language. For example, what is called unity language. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are going, huh? What? What does that mean? So this, in my opinion, is really the most confusing, or perhaps the only confusing category we have to think about. An object exchange, icon exchange, single page device, those are fairly common, more used. Touchscreen device, multiple page device, we see those being used a lot with students too, but then we think about, what does unity language mean? What does semantically compact intuitive language mean? This is a special kind of system, and let me jump back here for 1 second, and I'll give you some examples of those. As we look at different types of systems that use this language, a springboard, a vantage, accent. Okay, these are types of systems that use this. What this means is that, number one, the icons are always in the same place on that device. And the language is more compact. It doesn't work in the same way we think about language as far as how we structure a sentence. So if I want to say on a different device, I want a cookie, I might hit the I icon, the want icon, and the cookie icon, put that together in a sentence. With something like the springboard, vantage, and accent, you might have one icon that represents something like that, or one icon that represents I want, and then you can go out and find other ways. So there's different ways this language works that makes it more compact. It's just a different way of thinking about it. One of the reasons why we would choose this system for a student is for a student who has difficulties with motor planning. Actually, let me word that a different way. We would choose this for a student who can use motor planning to help them to communicate more effectively. The icons remain in the same place always. So for a student using one of the other devices, as he or she learns more language, those icons might move around on the pages, and you might get more pages, and it might be more complex, and so they really have to go and find those icons. With this type of system, instead, they always remain in the same place, so I can always use the same motor movements to make the same or similar types of messages. So just something for us to think about as we're choosing this kind of system and one of those considerations. All right, so I'm going to go back to the document here. So those are the devices that will, or the systems, I should say, that we're going to be considering. And as we scroll on down, I'm going to scroll slowly, and hopefully you have this and you're looking at it. We are going to ask ourselves this question. My student needs a system that. This is always going to be running through our heads as we're answering these questions, and then we're going to go down the list and ask ourselves these different questions. And again, we're going to ask for every student, what symbols do they currently recognize? And you see that this is color-coded green. And it's color-coded green, green light for everyone. We're going to ask these two sections for everyone to kind of make this, as you're in a meeting, working with teams, you say, I always need to do the green. It's an easy way to remember what you need to cover. So let's think about this for a second. My student needs a system that have the following symbols currently recognized. Uses objects rather than icons or pictures. Uses actual pictures rather than picture representations. Uses picture representations. Uses text. Has a keyboard to type words and sentences, and so on. And so you can look at these and determine what are the characteristics of the student, of the person, and then determine what type of symbols are required in the system that you're going to be selecting. Now, if you scroll on over, you will see some of those squares are grayed and some of those squares are white. If they are grayed, it means that is not a good match. Okay? So, if you need a student, if you have a student that has a need for pictures, you are going to see the object exchange is blocked out. That's not a good match. But you can see that there are other options there that would be really good matches. And so again, if it's white, it means it's a good match. If it's grayed out, it means this is not a good match for that particular need for that student. All right, let's go on down. My student needs a system that, let's look at features to facilitate learning abilities and needs. And so here are some of those. Shows a limited number of icons per page for those who currently communicate a few messages or may gain new messages at a slow pace. So this is for a particular type of learner, maybe someone who's just beginning to learn to communicate, or really as they learn new nouns or verbs or ways to communicate different messages. That pace might be rather slow, so we don't want to overwhelm him or her by having 18 icons on a page, for example, or 4 pages of icons that they have to scroll through. That might be overwhelming for that particular learner. And so again, you'll look at systems that have a good match for that particular characteristic. Conversely, is able to provide student with more than 32 icons that can be added instantly to allow student to quickly learn to deliver more messages. So this is for a learner that you see is just really picking up on that communication quickly, and we really want to stay ahead of him or her on the number of icons that we're able to add so that he or she can communicate effectively. I'm not going to read all of these, but you can pick out some of these as you have that document in front of you. Has a camera so new pictures can be added quickly. That might be a team consideration that we want to think about. Easily create a variety of familiar routine messages for the student, that there's certain things that that student finds him or herself wanting to say or wanting to communicate over and over again. So you'll want a system that's able to do that. We have everything on here that might be a good consideration, including motor planning that we talked about earlier, has voice output, and so these different considerations you'll want to think about regarding the learning needs of the student. Scrolling on down to the reddish area. Now these are considerations that might be less applicable to your student, but you'll want to consider each one. So you'll want to think about features to accommodate typing. Is that something relevant? If so, explore this area. Features to accommodate usability. So in other words, it might be a student who's not yet using the system, and you might have to help him or her be motivated by it a little bit. So things like has stylish, cool embellishments to increase acceptance of the system. Changing the voice quality so it sounds more like him or her, those might be some considerations. But here's another one. Is the device or the system able to do functions such as access the internet, send email, text? That might be important for the usability for that student. Conversely, for some students, that might be extremely distracting, and so we want a device that's able to block that. So you'll want to think about that in your considerations. Next, we have features to accommodate gross motor difficulties, like do we want something that fits in a pocket or on a belt holster or something like that, has a strap, mounting options on a wheelchair or anything of that nature. And then finally, we get down to the orange section. Again, likely fewer students will need to think about for this, but we do have some with more challenging needs and more intense considerations. So thinking about accommodating fine motor difficulties, switch activation, eye gaze, things of that nature. Features to accommodate hearing difficulties, and then of course, vision difficulties. All right, so I've already gone over this part, but again, to emphasize, there's 3 layers. All students, you will discuss symbols currently recognized, learning abilities and needs. For some students, typing, usability, and gross motor. And then for fewer students, fine motor, vision, and hearing. So how do you use this feature analysis? We really looked hard at this entire process, and again, our goal was to empower teams. But we wanted to empower teams without creating more barriers. And we wanted to empower teams without creating more barriers and further delaying the communication system selected and implemented for the student. So as we piloted this tool and as we looked at how to use this tool, this is a recommendation we are making. The entire inventory you're going to do together as a team. So you're going to talk about the current modalities for the student. You're going to talk about the emerging modalities for the student. You're going to talk about the past communication history of the student. You're going to do all of these as a team. When it's time to do a feature analysis, every team member around that table or part of this meeting, part of this process, will have this document in front of him or her, will fill it out independently. And they will do this by, number 1, identifying to themselves what are the top student priorities, what are the top characteristics at home, at school, wherever that student might be participating, what are my thoughts regarding the biggest priorities. And then based on that, they're going to look at those features on that feature analysis, and then they're going to identify the appropriate systems that might be a good match for that student. So again, this is all done independently. And I'll tell you the reasoning why is because we thought if that entire document is done as a team process and you went line by line by line, this is going to be a pretty lengthy process. And so we thought this is a way that everyone is able to consider it, is able to think about it, is able to look at each of those items and really consider those individually. But then we bring it back to the team. So once everyone has had a chance to look at that document, identify their priorities, and then identify the appropriate systems. So we're going to bring this together and discuss it as a team. We're going to put it on chart paper. We're going to identify, list the priorities, list the AAC systems that were identified as potential, and that's where we're going to start. That's really how we're going to narrow this down and make a really good match for this student. Now, one other part of this feature analysis, I said earlier, we have to be realistic about system maintenance and resource considerations. We have to think about, can we maintain the system? If that thing is sitting on a shelf waiting to be repaired, that's not doing any good for that student. So we have to think about the maintenance and resource considerations. So you will find on the back page of that feature analysis that there is a page for system maintenance, and then there are a few items under resource considerations. And so things to be thinking about: has a camera so new pictures can easily be added, requires team members to program information into the system to keep it updated, has a specific operating system, looking at the warranty, what happens if it's broken, what about the memory and storage, the battery life. All of these things are things that you'll want to think about regarding how that system will be used. So for example, if that student is using that system across the entire school day and then taking it home, the battery is a very real concern, and so you'll want to think about that, because again, if it has a dead battery, that's not doing a lot of good for the student. Some of these are things that you do want to think about as far as what is the true usability for that student, but some of these are things that might get you thinking as a team, if we pick that system, if that's the right fit for the student, then how are we going to address some of these issues? How are we going to ensure that if it's broken, it's repaired very quickly, or that we have someone who can update it, and those sorts of things. And then finally, the topic no one likes to talk about, the resource considerations. Is the system available in a reasonable time frame? This is something you have to think about. Again, we want that student communicating today, not 6 months from today. And so if it takes literally 3 months of trying to find that system or get it ordered, we might want to think about another option in the short term as we move into that one, or we might want to think about a different system altogether. These are things you'll want to think about. The last one is looking at, is this the best option for the cost? This is a question you will want to think about. It may not be the thing that ultimately makes the decision. Obviously, we cannot make decisions based on resources and based on the cost of items, but certainly there's been a lot of research on these different systems that we're advocating throughout this presentation to say these are viable systems, these are effective systems, and sometimes we can use a less costly system for the same results. And so we'll want to think about that, but we just want to evaluate, is this the best option for the cost? And we'll want to make all of these decisions in the context of truly what is the best fit for that student. That's what it all comes down to. Okay, moving on. We have now looked at the communication history. We have now looked at current modalities and emerging modalities. We have looked at our feature analysis to say, here are the student characteristics, and here's a good match based on systems. And we might have a laundry list of systems. Maybe we've identified 3 or 4, or maybe we've identified 2, whatever the case might be. This is time for the decision making. So what you're going to do is you're going to take those priorities of the student, and you're going to take those systems, and you're going to identify the advantages and the disadvantages of each of those. So again, this is where the teaming comes in. This is where the chart paper comes in. Identify the advantages and disadvantages. This particular system is very big and heavy, and he's in middle school, and he's walking between 6 different classrooms, and he's in the hallway and he's being bumped. That's not an effective system for him. So let's go with something lighter and more mobile. You're going to have those kinds of real conversations about the functionality and the usability, and again, those priorities that were identified for that particular student. You're going to list those. And through that process, you're going to identify the top 2. And you're going to put them in sequential order. What's your first choice? And then what's your second choice? We're going to identify 2, not because we're going to jump right in and try to implement 2 right away, but what we want to do is we're going to implement one of those systems. And we want the second one so that we can have a fallback in case it doesn't work well. But the real reason is, very often we find that students do well with multiple modalities, and so that second one might be another modality option. Well, we'll see. It's a wait and see. Let's implement one and see how it goes and see how much independence and progress we obtain, and then we can go from there. But again, you're going to take those advantages, disadvantages, and from those identify 2 systems. Now our next step, after we've identified those systems, very often what happens after a formal assessment is it ends here. The team process, the assessment process ends here. And so we've identified the system, and we hand it over to a speech pathologist, a parent, a teacher, and we say, this is the right one, goodbye and good luck. And so what we have added to this process is what we call the trial implementation phase. And what we want to do is, number 1, identify how we're going to get that system, who is responsible for getting that system, and the date by which it will be obtained or created. So for example, if we say an icon or a picture exchange communication system is appropriate, what is the date by which that system will be created? How many pictures are we creating in the very beginning? And then who is the person responsible for doing that? And by putting this here and by documenting it, we actually have an action plan to move forward. So this is a really important part of this process. We not only need to determine what is the appropriate system, but we have to say how are we going to get it and how are we going to get it quickly so that that student can be communicating and we can be teaching. We are going to next go into the trial implementation period. So what we want to do is we want to think about, okay, we have a date set by which we will have this system in place. And let's say it's a week from that meeting date or 3 days from that meeting date. We want to be aggressive. We want it to be fast. What we want to do is say, okay, we're going to have an implementation period. This is our trial implementation period. And we are going to say 3 to 5 weeks from that date, we are going to meet again to look at the data, to look at how the implementation went, and make a decision on what to do. Put more instructional time in place, train more people on how to use the system, try a different system. You know, you may not be ready for that step, but what we want to do is make sure in 3 to 5 weeks we come back as a team and look at the progress and make some changes if necessary. Perhaps that plan is to continue on. It's a good system. We think it's a good match. The student is starting to really show some progress. Then we will want to continue on with that course of action, of course. So after we set that date, now it's time to go and implement. So what we're advocating and through this document is that you basically outline the implementation plan. So again, we don't stop here. We don't say, okay, we have a date. We know in 3 to 5 weeks we're going to come back and talk about how things went. But instead we're going to have a plan for how we're going to implement this particular system in the next 3 to 5 weeks. And so you're going to have a lead team member or members, people or person who's responsible for making sure these steps happen. Here you're going to identify the person or people to be trained, the type of training required, who's going to do the training, and when will that begin. So again, if Jared is in math and social studies and PE class in middle school, then you need to identify people in those settings who may need to be trained. If there's a paraprofessional involved, maybe that person needs to be trained. There's a lot to think about here to make sure during this implementation period the people who know, who are interacting with that student, who will be teaching that student, know how to use this particular system. And then finally, down at the bottom of this particular document, you can see the location, activity for implementation, skills to be demonstrated, who will teach the use of the AAC, how, in other words, what sort of strategies will be used, and then what data will be collected. So this further will help you to delineate that plan. As we think about the different settings, Jared might use that AAC system a little differently in PE than he does in math, for example. But math and history might look kind of similar in how it's used. He might do some requesting, asking for help, and those sorts of things. So we'll really want to outline this so we know how it's going to be used across these different settings and how we're going to teach it in the context of our implementation period. So those are our tools that we have developed to help you develop and outline, identify, and implement augmentative and alternative communication systems for students with autism. We have these tools available for you on our website, on the VCU ACE website, and here on this page you can see our website. If you go to the tab titled Resources and then go down to Communication, that will lead you to these tools.